5,
4,
3,
2,
1,
go.
Hello and welcome to Space Now, the space news podcast from the National Space Centre that goes beyond the headlines. I'm space presenter Ed Kellon-Turner.
And I'm space expert Dhara Patel.
And today we're taking a look at conspiracy theories, specifically moon conspiracy theories. Did the moon landings happen? Why do we even have these conspiracy theories? Where did they come from? But first, usually at this point we go on to our Space Wows, headlines that we've taken a look at that really interest us. But Dhara, there's been a headline recently that kind of hits us close to home, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's definitely a story that's hit the headlines, but I don't know whether I would call it a space
Definitely
wow.
not a Space Wow.
But a really nice chance to celebrate the life of a very prominent figure in spaceflight history. So many of our viewers and listeners may have heard of the passing of Apollo astronaut Jim Lovell.
Yep.
So he passed away on the 7th of August, and there's so much to unpack about this particular astronaut.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so it was Apollo 13, almost the most famous Apollo mission, even though
wrong reasons.
For all the wrong reasons. Even though Apollo 11 landed first, Apollo 13 very famous for having that oxygen tank explosion and almost leading to the deaths of the 3 astronauts on board, right?
Yeah, and it was Jim Lovell that was the commander of that mission. But although that was his most perhaps prominent spaceflight mission, he has actually had 4 spaceflights in total. So
Amazing.
He went on 2 Gemini missions. So Gemini was NASA's second crewed spaceflight program.
Yep, after the Mercury one, right?
That's right. So we had Mercury, Gemini, and then Apollo. And then he had 2 Apollo flights. And before Apollo 13, he was actually on the flight of Apollo 8, which was the first time that humans ever left the vicinity of the Earth and travelled around the moon, all in preparation for that first landing.
And that was on about Christmas Day, wasn't it, when they were heading to the moon?
So
So what a Christmas present that would be.
I mean, on that flight we had like the picture of Earthrise being taken. We had them reading from the book of Genesis on Christmas Eve, and I also read that this goes to show how like romantic he was. He read from the book, and then he had someone basically turn up at his house, unknowingly like just deliver a present to his wife, and just after he'd read the message, she had got the present. It was like a mink jacket, and it basically said from your husband, the man on the moon. And it was just like, that's so cute, that's so romantic.
Yeah, some people say I love you to the moon and back. He literally did.
He was at the moon when
he was at the moon.
So yeah, he's had these notable spaceflight missions, but also he didn't necessarily come from a very privileged background. So he lost his father at a young age. His mother worked incredibly hard to make sure that he had the education, but he wasn't able to go to university. They just didn't have the funds to do that. So very kind of smart thinking, he decided to join the military and the Navy, and through that got his education in terms of like piloting, and also his interest was in like rocketry and rockets, which was quite cool,
because that was quite a lot of especially the very early astronauts, is they were sort of like test pilots, basically the people that were really pushing the boundaries of air flight, and therefore pushing the boundaries of space flight after that, going to the moon and things like that.
It really is. And we've glossed over some of these missions, but like every single one of the missions that he's been on, I should also say he was the first person to actually have 4 flights in space. And we don't necessarily think about like counting those up, but to be chosen over and over again for spaceflight missions just goes to show how well a character he was in terms of doing the work, but also how well loved he must have been from within the sort of group of astronauts.
I think the first to go to the moon twice as well. I think that's correct.
It is, but it's also, again, so sad that first to go to the moon twice, but never landed.
Yes, I think so. Obviously, there's the really famous Apollo 13 film with Tom Hanks playing Jim Lovell, and there's a line in there where he's talking about, I've already seen the moon once. I came here to land on the moon.
And just didn't do it.
Just not being able to. After, all that stress of what they were going through on Apollo 13, but still looking down at the moon not from orbit, they didn't orbit the moon on Apollo 13, but looking down and just going, no, I'll never
get to do that.
It is kind of sad, really, when you think about it.
I've watched Apollo 13 and I didn't quite realise it at the time, but he actually made a cameo in that film.
He's on the boat, right?
Yeah. And there's a story about them asking him. So when the capsule eventually landed down on Earth, they had a splash landing, and then you would have had the seafarers come and sort of rescue the astronauts from there. And they'd asked him to play the cameo role of one of the like, I don't know what you call them, like seafarers, and he was, they asked him to sort of dress up, and he was just like, no. I've been to the Navy, so he pulled out like his Navy attire, like clean press, and he was like, if I'm going to do the cameo, I'm doing it in this. I'm
doing it properly.
Yeah. So that's, also fitting that I guess that he was involved in such an incredible film, one of my favourite films as well.
Yeah, so we were just looking just before we started recording this, weren't we? There's only, we think, about 6 Apollo astronauts left. So unfortunately, we are losing that connection to the moon. But maybe we're going back. We'll get onto that a little bit later on. Now, while Jim Lovell unfortunately didn't get to land on the moon, we do know that people did land on the moon. Although there are some conspiracy theories that say, no, it didn't happen. I mean, there are some conspiracy theories that say the moon doesn't even exist and we live in sort of a dome. But kind of people saying that we didn't land on the moon. Where do you think, or even why do you think these moon conspiracy landing, these theories around that, why do you think they exist?
So I think, and we see it more and more today, I guess, is where we're like, bombarded with information. There's this kind of like what's true and what's not, and I think that's always been around in human consciousness, right? Like we see something, we want to understand it, but we don't want to be fooled, we don't want to be tricked or duped into something. And I think something as big as a moon landing, it's almost inconceivable. And when even now when we look back at it and we think people went to the moon, like people landed on the moon, and when we see some of the technology, like we've got a Soyuz craft, anyone that's been to the Science Museum and has seen like the Apollo spacecraft, it looks like a tin can, and
I mean it basically is a tin
can.
And
it's really hard to understand how that could have taken people to the moon safely and returned them. It's no mean feat, and so I think a lot of that conspiracy comes from perhaps the idea that we don't fully understand perhaps how something like this was possible, but also to make sure that we live in a society where we're not just like sucking in fake and false information, that we actually can challenge things and make sure that what we're being told is actually the truth.
Yeah, because that's the thing. These conspiracy theories, they don't stem from, the modern day, because, we are, as you say, bombarded by that information, so we get a lot of fake information nowadays. But these are even before that, when with the pre-internet, we were still getting these moon conspiracies. But I do think a lot of people, they want to be right, don't they?
Yep.
But they also like to be the only one that was right, or the one that said, like, I told you so. But it's as you said, like when you look at the kind of artifact, I mean, in Kennedy Space Center, they've got the Saturn V lying on its side, and I've looked at that, and I've been there, and I'm like, that is almost impossible to quantify how big that single rocket is. And I mean, we've got rockets here in our rocket tower, and the Saturn V itself is about 2.5 times the size of our rocket tower. It's enormous.
Yeah.
It's absolutely massive. The engines themselves are so unbelievably massive. And then when you also then look at pictures of them inside the spacecraft, it's a tiny spacecraft. It's a teeny tiny space that they had to be in there. And then you're told, they were in there for like a week. How? How have they been there for a week?
I think it also kind of goes back to this idea that science is changing, right? And science has changed. So even something as like today, our understanding that the sun is the center of our solar system and the planets and the earth are revolving or orbiting around it, that wasn't always the case, or that wasn't always the popular belief. And so where we've seen science change, and for what we thought was correct once to now being incorrect, perhaps the same sort of like logic stems here, in the sense that people are like, well, this is what we think now, but was it actually the case?
Yeah, it's rejecting, this literally happened, as you say, when the sun is the centre of the solar system. That used to not be the prevailing theory, but when evidence was supplied for that via like Galileo Galilei, people like that, people rejected that idea, and they said, no, that's not right, because we're right. We know what we're talking about. The Earth is the centre of the universe. I know you've got evidence, but I don't really care to listen to that evidence because I'm right.
This is what I believe, yeah.
So, Dhara, why do you think it's important that we on Space Now are talking about these conspiracy theories and what we're going to be doing, which is kind of debunking some of those conspiracy theories?
Yeah, I think one of these is that, in general, our role as science communicators is to ensure that people are well informed of what space is, what's happening in space, and how it affects our lives. And so, you know, a misunderstanding leads to misbelief. And actually, science is helping to sort of drive and develop the world. And so we've got to make sure that people have a trust within what they're being taught. And that doesn't have to always be top down. I'm a scientist and I'm telling you and this is what you believe. Yeah. But for people to actually be on that journey and experience that in the same way, or be able to kind of make out that information for themselves, I think is incredibly important.
It's, as you say, like, not just going, you know, this, I hear your conspiracy theory, you're wrong.
Yes.
We want to explain why the actual evidence is there, what we can actually see from that, and why this actually maybe actually shows the fact that we have been there, rather than maybe it was just filmed on a film set, which is one of those things that people like to throw around.
We're going to go through a few of the conspiracy theories.
Yes, absolutely. Well, to make it, I think, a little bit easier, what I'm going to do, again, disclaimer, I do believe in the moon landings. Dhara,
are you sure?
I'm sure. Are you sure you believe in the moon landings? Absolutely. So, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on a metaphorical tin hat and pretend, basically, that I'm a conspiracy theorist. I'm going to get these bits of evidence, I'm going to put them to you, and I want you to try and prove to me, kind of using that evidence, that the moon landings did actually happen.
Okay, I'm going to do my best.
Do that best. So, what we're going to start off with is some of the pictures that we get from them. You know, there's this really famous one of, I think it's Buzz Aldrin standing on the moon's surface. You've got the moon lit up underneath him, and then a completely black sky. Where are all the stars?
Oh dear. Yeah, it's one of the main conspiracy theories that comes up. And of course, I'm sure you've been asked about this question before. I certainly have. And, you know, this comes back to something that we can actually experience here on Earth. And it's due to the technology that is being used. So, yes, we know that in space, you know, you don't have light pollution to contend with. Space would be full of stars. Now, if you were an astronaut standing on the moon and you weren't necessarily facing directly towards the sun where its light would drown it out, you'd be able to see the stars in the sky, but the photographs don't seem to show it.
Yeah.
And the reality of that is because of something called dynamic range. So whenever you've got like a camera, you have a range in which it can pick up kind of light. So think about it like anyone that's seen like a thermometer filled with mercury. You have the 0 and you have 100. That's the range. Now, if you get any warmer, the mercury is going to expand and it's going to go beyond. Similarly, when you've got like the speedometer in your car, it's got a range, right? From 0 to 100 or whatever it is. Now, the idea is that the moon is incredibly bright. And so you've got really bright kind of conditions where you're trying to snap a picture of the moon, but of course the stars in the background sky are very faint.
Yeah.
And so when you take an image, you're taking an image over a certain amount of time, something called exposure. Now, if you take an image for a long amount of time, what happens is you're collecting so much of that bright light from the surface of the moon that it overexposes the moon, so you can't see detail, but you'll capture the faint light of the stars.
Yeah.
And the opposite, if I take a really short exposure, what happens is now I don't collect too much light from the moon because it's so bright, it's still enough to capture the detail there, but I haven't had enough time to capture the light of the distant stars.
Exactly. And we're not there to capture stars. We're there to capture the moon. So we don't have those photos of a completely kind of white base, so you could sort of see a bleached out astronaut on it, but you can see loads of stars, because that's not interesting to us.
That's exactly the point. They were there on the surface, capturing images of the surface of the moon, and to do that, because of the high like albedo, because it's so reflective, you've got to make sure that you've got a short exposure where you're not capturing too much light that it just oversaturates your picture and it just ends up a white blur. But in the process, you cannot capture the faint light of all those distant stars. So yeah, if we wanted to, we could, but we wouldn't have any pictures of the moon.
Yeah.
So,
and you could actually have a little go at this at home, like very, very dark, very, very clear. You could probably see some stars just using your eyes. Get your camera out though, take a picture. You're not going to see any stars. Or if you then put an exposure on, as you say, for say 10 seconds, you will see more of those stars start to appear because it's collecting more and more light. So you'll actually be able to see this at home as a little bit of an experiment if you want to.
So hopefully that kind of sets that conspiracy aside, in the sense that it's not that the stars aren't there, it's just that with a camera we're limited in terms of what light we can collect without oversaturating or not being able to collect the light of the stars.
I'm convinced by that. But
Okay, good.
I've got another one to do with photography, with cameras. We've probably all seen Neil Armstrong kind of step down onto the surface of the moon. He's the first man on the moon. Who filmed the first man on the moon walking on the moon before he'd even got to the moon?
Yeah, so this one is a bit of a, it looks like somebody is outside the spacecraft already. And, you know, a lot of these conspiracy theories are built around this idea that this is a set. This is a set up somewhere here on Earth. And, you know, all these pictures and images are taken by all those working in NASA, and it's a big charade and a conspiracy.
Yep.
The reality is that even today, we have cameras outside of a spacecraft. So when you were talking about like the launch of Artemis, when we've seen things like the James Webb Space Telescope launch and we see it like pull away from like the upper stage of the rocket, we fix cameras to different parts of a spacecraft, of the rocket, for us to be able to capture different things. And so there was a camera mounted to the outside of the lunar descent module. So this is the part of the Apollo spacecraft that kind of lands down on the moon rather than the bit that orbits around the moon. And on the leg of one of the kind of lunar descent module's parts, there was a camera that was deliberately facing towards the ladder. Now, you and I know that if we want to take a picture on our mobile phone, we've got to press the shutter button, right? So I've got to be next to the camera. But this camera in particular was set up so that Buzz Aldrin from inside the capsule could actually turn that camera and that video feed on without having to step outside of the spacecraft. So Buzz Aldrin in charge inside, turns on camera. Camera is already positioned on the spacecraft outside and captures Neil Armstrong as he comes down.
Because that's the thing, an actually very vital part of the first landing on the moon was to be able to prove that they landed on the moon. You know, we're in the middle of the space race, the Soviet Union also trying to get to the moon, so America want to show that they're the first to be on the moon. So they do plan things like that, camera setup. I think I've even seen a video of what is essentially the entire descent down to the lunar surface on certain other missions. I don't think it was Apollo 11, but you do see them, and it's an incredibly grainy photo or video. But what else do you expect? It's gone that way in the... and
it's also technology from like the 60s. There's also another video of, I think it's one of the later Apollo missions, where the lunar ascent module, once the mission is complete, goes back up to join with the other parts of the Apollo module in orbit around the moon. And you might think, well, who's on the ground on the surface of the moon, like filming it going up? But they actually had to calculate using like the thrust of the ascent module and like the distance away that it was to work out, okay, how quickly should that camera pan to be able to capture it? So yeah, it's all to do with sort of pre-planning and kind of remote operation rather than being there and going, hey, I'm taking a picture of you right now.
Yeah, perfect. But here's another one. So we've already said we've landed on the moon, okay. But I've got a thought that maybe we can't even get to the moon.
Okay.
You see, I've heard about this guy called Van Allen, and he has got a belt. Not on his waist, but this radiation belts around the Earth. Kind of these areas of high radiation, and there is no way that any human is able to sit inside that radiation belt without becoming
frying.
Extremely ill, without frying. So how do you think we can get through there to get to the moon? How is that possible?
Okay, so to set the scene, we're not talking about a leather belt on a guy called Van Allen, like you mentioned. So because the Earth has a magnetic field, that magnetic field basically interacts with charged particles, a bit like when you pull two magnets together and you feel like an attraction or a repulsion. And in space, our sun gives off like the solar wind, it's giving off charged particles, and it means that interacts with our Earth's magnetic field, but there are certain regions around the Earth where those charged particles become more concentrated in almost rings or belts known as the Van Allen belts. Now, that would be the equivalent of us probably standing in like an X-ray machine all day being bombarded by X-rays. So the reality is we don't want to send people into the Van Allen radiation belts, but we also, if we have to, want to get them out of there as quickly as possible. And so there are kind of theories that suggest that, well, if the astronauts had to travel through those belts which surround the Earth in order to get to the moon, they wouldn't have survived, or they would have been fried, or, you know, they would have ended up with serious health issues. But the reality is they were traveling through it so quickly, and those kind of trajectories were planned, that it's almost like the analogy of walking over hot stones.
Yeah.
So you can walk over like fire, but no one's going to be like, I'm just going to like slowly tiptoe my way over. Like, if you're going to do it, you're going to do it real fast. Because the reality is the faster you get through it, the less exposure that you have. And that's the same case with the Van Allen radiation belts. From what I understand, the speed at which they were traveling and the trajectories that they made, and also the time at which the Apollo kind of missions took place, which was after the solar maximum of that period. So this was a time when the sun wasn't at its maximum period of activity, so you'd have less of those charged particles streaming out, that they would travel through quickly enough that it would be like having a few X-rays. So it's not like being bombarded like some kind of, I don't know, Hollywoodized dramatic scene. It's still not ideal, but to be able to get to the moon and do some science, having a few X-rays like people do on the Earth.
I'm sure many people will be like, I'll take a few X-rays if I get to go to the moon. And of course, they do have some shielding from the actual spacecraft itself. Not completely 100%, but enough, basically.
Yeah, they would have had the aluminium sort of outer shell of their spacecraft, and they could have used other materials within the spacecraft as well to help kind of shield from some of that radiation if there was like an intense flare or something.
Okay, perfectly. So they can get to the moon. I'm convinced they've landed on the moon and everything like that.
They've got there safely?
Filmed them.
Okay.
Perfect. But one big thing that everyone knows about Apollo is that they planted those flags.
Okay.
But when you watch them, they're waving in the wind. There's no wind on the moon. There's no atmosphere at all. So how can they be waving in the wind?
Sure. So we have hopefully all seen that very iconic image of the Apollo astronauts planting a flag in the moon, on the surface of the moon.
I tell you what, we'll get producer Lucy to put it on the screen now if you're watching on YouTube as well.
And also, you've done a video on this, which helps with some of the
it's
sort
quite
of
ironic
imagery.
that I'm being the conspiracy
That's
theory
fine.
when I've already debunked this conspiracy theory.
But yeah, you're right. The moon isn't like the Earth. So like 101 with the moon, it's, much smaller than the Earth. Its gravity is much weaker. It doesn't have much of an atmosphere at all. And the fact that when we see the moon planted there, it looks like it's waving, makes it appear as though there's some sort of weather system or there's wind happening. But the reality is that if you look at that picture very carefully, you'll see that there's a rod along the top of the flag. And they put that there to make sure that when they planted the flag, it would be extended and it wouldn't have sort of been shriveled up and stuff.
And it wouldn't make for a good picture, would
No,
it?
it wouldn't. You want to see the entire flag,
exactly.
right? And anyone that's been to like the beach or anywhere and try to like stick something in the soil or the sand, you don't just plonk it in. It doesn't go very far in. You have to kind of twist and turn it as you're doing it to help it get a bit deeper in. And in that process, what we notice even here on Earth is that we get a bit of back and forth motion. Now, because the moon has weaker gravity and also the fact that there is no wind, there's no atmosphere to kind of blow the flag in a different direction, what we're actually just seeing is the kind of remnants of that motion. We're seeing it being kind of left in a position in which it was implanted into the soil with.
Okay, fantastic. Are those flags still there?
So a lot of the missions would have planted flags. I believe all of them did. But it's really difficult to work out whether some of them are still standing.
Okay.
And I know there was something about people trying to look for the Apollo 11 flag. But one of the astronauts, I think, claimed that when they lifted off in the ascent module of the lunar spacecraft on their return back into lunar orbit before they headed back to the Earth, that thrust basically blew the flag down because it was placed really close to the spacecraft.
So especially on Apollo 11, they weren't going very far. They were basically there to prove that they could. Obviously, they did some science with that, but not really. Especially by the end, when they're there for a couple of days, they've got those lunar roving vehicles. They're able to go much further. They could plant that flag a little bit further at a safe distance.
I think Apollo 11 it was like a few hours, and then Apollo 17 we were a few days.
Okay, I think we're going to do one more now.
Okay.
And I want to talk about the shadows themselves.
Okay.
So when you take a look at pictures, rather than being shadows being nice and parallel, as you would expect, they don't look very parallel at all. They actually look like they're coming from two different light sources.
Uh-oh.
Could they be studio lights that are causing these shadows? So what's actually going on?
Yeah, so again, going back to this idea that many people thought that this was a set, and what we see on some of the Apollo photographs is that you've got like the spacecraft, the lunar module, and then you've got an astronaut, or you've got the flag, and the shadows are in slightly different directions, and it kind of makes us think that there are different lights, i.e. studio or set lights, that are causing those different or unparalleled shadows. But again, this is something that we can test here on Earth. Now, whenever you've got a light source and you've got objects quite close to it, that light will cast a shadow behind those objects. But because they're really close, what happens is those shadows are parallel. So I wouldn't expect from where we're sitting, if we had like a light, between us, the shadows from our laptops won't be going in completely different directions. They would be parallel because they're very close to the light source. Yeah. But if you've ever been to a park or an open space at sunset or at sunrise, and you've looked at trees, you might notice that the shadows of the trees are not parallel, especially when the sun is low down in the ground and we can see those long shadows more clearly, as opposed to when the sun is high in the sky and we get short shadows. And that's because the sun is incredibly far away, that when you have a light source that's far away from your objects, we find that the objects, the shadows tend to be a little bit divergent. Yeah. They tend to not be parallel. And that's what we're seeing here on the surface of the moon. The light source is the sun, but the sun is like 150 million kilometers away. And so the shadows that we get aren't perfectly parallel. It's not because of studio lights and set lights or being multiple lights. It's simply the fact that there is a light source that is much further away.
I also think with a lot of these conspiracy theories, it's a case of, let's give NASA credit. They are very smart. Do you really think that some of the smartest people on Earth wouldn't think about these things and would accidentally, for example, set up two different light sources, like that?
And there's so many more as well. And, you know, one of the other ones that very quickly springs to mind is like one of the rocks had a little like C shape on it. Yeah. And, you know, there's conspiracy theories to say it was a set prop, like that it was marked with the letter C because it had to go in this particular position. You know, there are hundreds of rocks on the moon. Are all of them going to be labelled?
Exactly.
It turned out to be that the original doesn't have a C marking in it, and actually it's a photocopy of that image, and an eyelash or something got into the photocopier and made that little C print. So there are comparisons of images that have been reproduced compared to the original image that show the difference.
And I think one of the best ways to debunk all these conspiracy theories, like did the moon landings actually happen? Yes, because we can see them and the fact that they've landed. So we've sent satellites into orbit around the moon, for example, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter from NASA, and that can take pictures of the landers on the moon, or what is left of the landers, of course. And even if you don't believe NASA, then believe, for example, India have also taken pictures. China have also taken pictures of these landers on the moon. So it's not just kind of the US going, yes, we definitely did it. Here's these edited pictures. No, it's countries from all around the world are able to see the landers on the moon.
I think it stems perhaps that one from a little longer ago where we didn't have the ability to do that. So the Hubble Space Telescope, as powerful as it is, it doesn't have the resolution to pick up something as small as a lunar lander. In fact, it could probably pick up something that's about 100 meters across. Anything smaller than that, the Hubble Space Telescope isn't going to be able to discern. We've got big optical telescopes on the Earth, you know, some in the Canaries. Again, they can get down to maybe 20, 30 meter resolution, but actually it's the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and those around or kind of lunar orbit that have the resolution to be able to pick up these small bits.
But one final conspiracy theory before we move on. Okay. My favourite one.
All right.
It's all about the first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong.
Okay.
Neil A.
Okay.
Do you know what Neil A backwards is? It's alien.
Ed.
So, did we send Neil Armstrong to the moon, or did we send him back to the moon? Did he originally come from? I don't know. But what we're going to finally talk about after that, just a little bit of thinking for everyone at home there.
Sure.
What we're going to finally talk about is kind of the reason we haven't been back. The last moon mission, the last Apollo mission, I should say, Apollo 17, 1972. So for over 50 years, we haven't sent people back to the moon. Why not? What's been going on?
I think a lot of when we look back at that era, that space race era, it was driven very heavily by political agendas. And I think it was like 4% of the US budget was spent on Apollo.
And
it
now
was
it's less than 1% by a long way.
It was a lot of money that was injected into this. And I think once we had humans set foot on the moon. That mission was it was done. The objective had been reached. And there were a couple of missions where we started to delve into the science, but actually funding just wasn't able to keep up with being able to send people back. And so what we've concentrated on in the past, 50, 60 odd years is actually, well, if we're going to go back out into space, let's not make it for a few hours or a few days. How do we get humans living and working in space for a longer period of time? And that's quite dangerous, doing it on the moon, where you're, much further away. Anything goes wrong and rescue and recovery is going to take a lot longer. Let's do it in Earth orbit. Let's get humans living in a microgravity environment and working out, how does space affect the human body? What challenges do we need to overcome as we head deeper into space? And so a lot of work has been done with things like the International Space Station.
So space station is really important. I did a bit of research of this before. So before, when we were just sending kind of a single craft up into space, the longest time any people were on board, that was 2 people. It was a Soviet mission. They were there for 18 days. And it was not a good 18 days. By the end of it, I think they got very, very cranky, very annoyed, not very happy, probably very smelly as well by the end of that, not really able to move around. And that's basically the upper limit. You can't really go beyond that when it's just a small single craft. So, as you say, moving on to space stations. So we had Salyut, we had Skylab, we had Mir as well, and finally the International Space Station. And I mean, the longest someone has been in space, I think it was on Mir, was about, I'm gonna say something and assume I'm correct.
Okay,
it's 438 days.
I think it's definitely over 400 days. And again, I'm just going to plug everything that you've done here, Ed. If anyone wants to know a little bit more about some of the space stations, then actually we have a blog that you've written about the history of space stations and kind of the aims and the objectives with different ones there.
And also a bit of the future of space stations as well, because we're learning so much. If we want to go to the moon, we are thinking about going back, right, with Artemis. We mentioned it a little bit more, but we're not just going there for Apollo 11 there for a few hours. What's the point? We want to be there for a long time. So it's learning about that in low Earth orbit, as you say, where we can save people if needed. If something drastic goes wrong, we can get them back to planet Earth really, really quickly. But if we want to go to the moon, if we want to go further afield to Mars as well, there's a lot. Even now, there's still a lot to learn, right, before we even go that far.
Yeah, and you've mentioned Artemis. So Artemis is NASA's next human spaceflight program, but they're working so much more internationally with people in countries all over the world to make this possible. And we've already had Artemis 1, which was testing the SLS rocket and the Orion spacecraft. So basically testing the technology that's going to get humans there. We're hoping that we'll see Artemis 2 next April, which will, for the first time, take humans back into orbit around the moon. So there'll be crew placed on the spacecraft, on the Orion spacecraft on the SLS rocket. And then hopefully the following year, in 2027, we'll have boots back on the moon with Artemis 3. But the reality is that, we need to learn a little bit more about the moon and not just living in space. And so right now what we're seeing is a flurry of robotic missions, notably at the beginning of this year, and we'll continue to see these private missions where they're going out to scope the lunar South Pole, because that's where we really think the resources are that will make being able to survive and live on the moon for a longer period of time more viable. And
from all over the world, right? So the first soft landing was actually by India, at the lunar South Pole, that is. We've also had a Japanese company and then a couple of companies in the US. Some of them try and fail to land on the moon, but some successful as well. So, as you say, this flurry of robotic missions, all hopefully very shortly. I say hopefully because it keeps getting delayed.
Yes.
But hopefully Artemis 3 landing on the lunar surface.
So it's not like why haven't we gone back because we're never going back. It's just this idea of we're going back for a different purpose now, for a longer period of time, and what we need to do is prepare before we do that.
Yes, NASA is very much... We concentrate a lot on NASA. They are one of the people that are pushing forward with lunar missions, but there's also other countries such as China as well that are ramping up slowly their moon missions. But we'll focus on NASA for now. They are very, very much beholden to the public and to the House and the Senate of America. So if something goes wrong, they're going to lose loads of funding. They're going to lose kind of their place in public society as well. So they need to be really careful and make sure that if they do a moon mission, it is a perfect success and nothing goes wrong, basically.
Yeah, that's high stakes.
Yeah, when you look back to the Apollo missions, actually quite a lot of stuff went wrong and almost led to disaster. We talked about Apollo 13, but even stuff like people almost being unable to land on the moon, and they have to fix it by pushing something with a pen and kind of using some janky code to make sure things. It was not
even Apollo
the best.
11, right, with the computer overriding over and over again when they're going to land. But yeah, there's lots to look forward to, and I guess one of the things that is something that we think about here is, we've had these conspiracy theories in the past. How might that affect when humans return to the moon with the Artemis program? And, one of the things you mentioned is this idea of technology and how actually we will have video feeds and we will have like communication links with the astronauts where we'll hear from them and we'll see them. But actually, we know that CGI and that stuff exists too, and so we've got a real challenge, I think, as well, of making sure that we portray these kind of missions and show people actually how this is possible, how it's working, so that we don't kind of get these conspiracy theories coming up again. Although I doubt that they'll ever go away.
Yeah, they'll probably always be around, but it's making sure when kind of our audience at home are taking in information, they're getting it from the right sources. So not just from the Space Now podcast, not to plug ourselves, but also places like NASA and ESA, kind of actual space agencies or companies actually getting their information from the source rather than a diluted thing from the internet that might be, as you say, CGI or some random AI video that's been made by someone on their own computer.
Yeah. And again, the reason why we're doing this podcast is to disseminate the information, right? Share it, and then it's up to people to make their own mind up. Like, get all the facts that you can, and then decide, like, what you make of it.
Well, you have thoroughly convinced me. Hopefully you've thoroughly convinced some people at home as well. But that actually brings us to the end of Space Now for today. Thank you very much for joining me. Thank you, Dhara.
Thanks, Ed.
And we'll actually be back in 2 weeks' time for our next episode. So make sure you subscribe wherever you are listening to this podcast to make sure you do not miss anything. Hit the notification bell as well. If you've got any questions at all about anything to do with space, make them really, really difficult and then send them in to podcast@spacecentre.co.uk. We have a mailbag episode coming up very, very shortly. Dhara, you might be on it, so make it very, very difficult.
Thanks,
if
Ed.
you can. But send them in, let us know your name, and maybe you'll get a shout out in the future. But until then, thank you very much everyone for joining us on Space Now.